Hello, everyone. Welcome into another video here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. In my last video here on Bolt Breakdowns, I did talk about Mike Williams' free agency and, what's going to happen with that. I want to continue this free agency series, so we are going to get to the Kaiser Whites and Uchenna Nwosus and Chris Harris and all of those guys in due time. But I do want to talk about the free agents that are, the most interesting for the Chargers. And the next in that series to me is actually Linval Joseph. I think Linval Joseph is a guy that not a lot of people talk about when it comes to Chargers free agency. He's not some big free agent to go get or to re-sign, but his role in 2020 and 2021 and going forward will kind of be interesting to watch, right? Of course, Linval Joseph was originally signed in 2020 to that 2-year, $17 million contract. This was after the Chargers sort of, famously missed out on Brady. He ends up going to Tampa. Would say it's worked out pretty well for the Chargers considering they got Justin Herbert, who looks like a top, 5 guy in the league. But with that money that they didn't sign Tom Brady with, the Chargers in a state of transition between the end of Phillip Rivers and Tyrod Taylor, they ended up going out and signing Chris Harris, Linval Joseph, Brian Bulaga, Nick Vigil, and sort of building out their team from there on these short-term contracts for guys that were going to be around ultimately for 1 or 2 years. So Linval Joseph was probably the best signing of that group. I don't think many people would say it's Chris Harris. Brian Bulaga probably should have been the best signing of that group, but unfortunately dealt with injuries as he did. And Linval Joseph really provided kind of a boon for this team after they moved on from Brandon Mebane, of course, in 2019, or after 2019, I should say. But now they sort of find themselves in this position where, well, I mean, Linval Joseph is kind of in that Brandon Mebane position, right? He's a little bit older. This was his worst rush defense season, which we'll talk about in a second. And now he's entering what's probably going to be the final NFL contract of his career for a guy who's been in the league for 12 years, whether that's a 1-year deal or a 2-year deal. Hell, he may decide to retire this season. I don't think that would actually be that crazy, as PFF mentions in their piece. So let's actually start to talk about what kind of PFF has said about Linval Joseph and what they project for him, right? So this is from PFF in their top 100 free agents article that they wrote. Joseph has long been one of the NFL's premier nose tackles, and while his 62.9 overall grade and 49.1 run defense grade represent his lowest single season marks since 2011, he's earned a career best 83.0 pass rush grade this season. So that actually stuck out to me because I didn't really think that Linval Joseph was that good against the pass, but you actually look at the numbers and they are sort of backed up. He did have about, I think, 10 fewer pressures from year to year, or 24. Let me actually look at the total amount of pressures. I don't think this was by any means like the highest season of his career or anything, but also keep in mind, he did miss a lot of games and had a significant amount fewer pass rushing snaps. So if you go from year to year, from 2020 to 2021, he had 10 fewer pressures, but also about 150 fewer pass rush snaps from year to year. So he kept his pass rushing, remarkably consistent, got a sack this year, which was big for him. And had some good moments, I think, in the pass rush game where he got in the backfield. I think this was particularly earlier in the season. You saw that, and then it kind of tailed off at the end. But talking about Linval's season from game to game, I think there was the rough start for the run defense, right? The Washington game wasn't great, but then the Dallas game really kind of drags them down. And then, of course, Nick Chubb against the Chargers in LA was not fun. But he sort of finds his groove here, both as a pass rusher and a run defender. It kind of came in games where the Chargers ended up losing anyway, right? Like Baltimore, New England, and Minnesota. But his game against Philadelphia was, his best game of the year and maybe his best game as a Charger overall, both as a pass rusher and a run defender. Ended up having 7 tackles in that game and 6 run stops. So while the Eagles were running on the Chargers pretty bad in that game, Linval Joseph was a lone bright spot. And I thought that was just a point in the season where he kind of found himself again after struggling earlier in the year, as you're seeing here. But then, unfortunately, right after the Minnesota game, Linval Joseph struggles with the shoulder injury, which kept him out for a while. And then, unfortunately gets COVID. And as we saw with a lot of the Chargers and a lot of players around the league, they were less productive across the board after they got COVID. And so I think that's also what happened to Linval Joseph when he came back. Not that he was a particularly bad run defender necessarily relative to the first half of the season, but he was definitely less noticeable in games in terms of being that force in the middle that we saw in 2020. And I think the shoulder injury obviously held him back a little bit as well. It didn't feel like that was ever at 100% this year when it came to Joseph. I think his season is sort of split into these three parts where he struggled at the beginning, sort of starts to find himself into the Philadelphia game, which is the peak of his season. And then unfortunately, after the Minnesota game, has COVID, has injuries, and then it just sort of like dragged his production down, as you can see in some of these games where he just wasn't quite as crisp, wasn't quite as noticeable as a force on the interior, and the Chargers got gashed like they did against Houston, where they made Johnny Sins of running backs. God, I actually can't remember his name just because I've called him Johnny Sins so much. But Rex Burkhead. They made Rex Burkhead look like the modern day Emmitt Smith. That was not a fine effort for the run defense as a whole. But you could just kind of see that the Chargers and Joseph a little bit himself sort of teetered towards the end of the season as well after all the injuries and COVID, unfortunately for him. So going back to PFF's projections, they don't project a whole lot for Linval Joseph, right? His contract should be about 1 year, 6 or 7 million if he does decide to play and not ultimately retire. And bottom line, they wrote that Joseph is getting on in years, but he can still be useful as a part of the defensive line rotation, particularly for a team that's struggling up the middle, right? You can sort of see Linval Joseph going to a spot where there's going to be a 4-3, defense opportunity out there, and he'll probably play pretty well, especially if he's more in a rotational role than a starter role. But I think he can certainly still at least have another year in him. Whether that's going to be with the Chargers, though, is the question. And Linval Joseph was sort of brought in to be that 4-3 defensive nose tackle in the Gus Bradley era. Now they're in the 3-4, sort of versatility based Brandon Staley era, and it sort of just feels like he fits out. And I think that's why in a lot of our free agent projections that we've talked about on this channel, they don't really include Linval Joseph, partially because, the 20th ranked run defense is the 28th ranked run defense, and we think Tom Telesco is going to go after guys and retool that whole line. But there's a lot of uncertainty in addition to Joseph as well, right? Justin Jones is a free agent. Christian Covington is a free agent. Really the only defensive tackle on the team right now. You have Braden Fajoko, obviously, who's a contributor and still on the roster. But really the only main defensive tackle on this team right now is Jerry Tillery, which is kind of a horrifying thought going into free agency. But obviously that's going to be one of their focuses in free agency and in the draft. So it's tough to kind of see Linval Joseph coming back. And it reminded me of another situation, obviously back after the 2019 season when the Chargers had Brandon Mebane, right? And they had to decide whether to keep him or cut him, right? Sort of heading into the final year of his deal. And their run defense grades are actually pretty similar. Linval Joseph was actually graded a little worse against the run than Brandon Mebane was. Brandon Mebane not nearly as good of a pass rusher as Linval Joseph was, as you kind of see. But I do think they're in sort of the same contractual age position. I think Mebane might have been 2 years older at the time, but Linval Joseph is heading into his age 34 season. And now it just sort of feels like he's kind of at his end with the Chargers, much like Mebane was when they cut him after 2019. So it'll be interesting to see kind of what happens with Linval Joseph in terms of his contract situation. And if another team kind of takes a chance on him, I do think they will, because, he is a space eater and there is more kind of to be said for him. And he probably does have another year or two left in him as a whole. And of course, we talked about his contract situation a little bit. He did sign this 2-year contract with the Chargers back in the day. We talked about maybe extending him into 2022 last offseason just to reduce the cap hit for 2021 and still retain him on the team. But of course, that didn't happen. And now Linval Joseph is officially a free agent once the new league year starts. So I think that's something that if the Chargers had extended him last offseason, obviously we would be talking about him as somebody on the team. But I think that was also very intentional given the change in defensive schemes that Linval Joseph wouldn't be back. And that's maybe something we should have talked about at the time. But the shift to 3-4, in addition to COVID, in addition to injuries, in addition to his age, is probably the reason that Linval Joseph won't be back on the Chargers next year. But there's a lot of things up in the air defensively, and you can sort of, like I said, see Linval Joseph going to that 4-3 team and still playing pretty decent. I hope it doesn't end up being like the Raiders or something. Obviously Gus Bradley's not there, but they're still going to be running a 4-3 scheme. Maybe they'll end up needing a nose tackle or someone to kind of fill up tackles for them, but he could go to a large probably list of teams on a 1-year deal if they do need production, right? And sort of PFF has talked about his strengths and weaknesses, right? His size and strength, I do think, are still very much strengths for him. It's a little weird to see PFF be like, oh, it was the worst run defense grade of his career, and also be like, run defense is a strength for Linval Joseph at this point. Which, I mean, it is his calling card, but he's kind of clearly declining in that sense as a player. So I think it's a little weird to put it under strengths as opposed maybe to somewhere between strengths and weaknesses. But his age and how dynamic he is not what he was in New York, not what he was early on in Minnesota either. And I think that's probably one of the reasons that he will end up walking for the Chargers. But I want to kind of now throw the question to you guys. What do you think the Chargers should do with Linval Joseph? What do you think they should do with their defensive tackle group as a whole? As I mentioned, Justin Jones is a free agent. Christian Covington is a free agent. And now they're sort of in this position where they could go a lot of different ways here with picking up guys like Sebastian Joseph Day, or people in free agency on the defensive tackle room. Or, of course, a lot of people want Jordan Davis, but there's plenty of other defensive tackles in the draft as well. I think it's safe to say that Linval Joseph probably won't be back. But let me know if you were if you were Tom Telesco and you were, what would you do with Linval Joseph? We sort of talked about this with Mike Williams last episode. I expect this to be a little bit more one-sided in terms of an exercise. I think most people would probably let Linval walk. But let me know what you would do with Linval Joseph down in the comments below. And I will see you guys on the next free agency.